SEO. Like I said at the start of our conversation, SEO is complex, it's challenging, but it's not magic. All SEO is a common method used to make content more visible online. Search engines are viewing your content differently than how you as a human being are viewing it. The way that we look at the information, the visibility of it, what we're trying to search for, isn't necessarily the way that a search engine is looking for the information. So there are things that are happening that we can see and things that we can't see, and that's typically referred to as on-page SEO, meaning what we can visibly see, and then technical SEO is behind the scenes, the things that we're doing to really enhance the content so that a search engine will find it more readily.
You know, Paul, let me interrupt you here for a second, because this point is so important, and it's one that I only realized, you know, kind of the implications of this maybe a few weeks ago when you and I were talking about redesigning our site for SEO. You know, our site's about a year old. We like the way it looks. It's got all the stuff on it that we think is important. But when we implemented this design a year ago, we didn't think about it in terms of what's the search engine going to find? What are people looking for? And are they going to find us? We're just like, oh, well, we need a page that says our services and a page that says about us. But we didn't really think about it in terms of who's looking for what we can offer, and are we making it easy for the search engines to give that back to them? And to me, that was an amazing revelation.
Right. Well, and I remember the conversation too, and I kind of used this idea that there's a gap between how we present our information and how people actually find our information. And that's
it's right up here. The gap is here.
It's typically right there, right? But it's also a technical gap in the sense that we perceive how we are presenting our information, our services as a business in one way, and we're not necessarily paying attention to how it's being perceived by the search engine. And so we could put a lot of effort into making a visually compelling design. We can spend a lot of effort in defining what we're wanting to do, whether we're a services company or we're a trade association. But we're not looking at the data to see, are people finding us for what we think they're finding us for? And that's part of, you know, learning how SEO works, is bridging that gap, filling that gap, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, one of the things that we sort of talk about is that our information is constantly being looked at. We're just not aware of it, right? We see the information we put out online, and it meets some level of, you know, this is a good piece of information. We like the design, the links work, it represents us well, but we typically don't take that next step to say, are people finding it? You know, and I think if you added that metric, web developers would be sweating a lot, because web developers can produce good content. They can produce visually compelling information. And now in the modern day with HTML5, you can have reflexive design that's applicable to a website or a tablet or multiple different cell phones. Great. It looks good. It works. But are people finding it? Right. Mm-hmm. And again, that goes back to what we were talking about in terms of a gap.
Right.
You know, and we may understand how people think of what we're doing, but we definitely don't understand how this machine, how this algorithm looks at what we're doing. And that's sort of why I have this on the second note here, the notion of we're being indexed and ranked.
Right.
You know, and all an index is compiling information based on a series of parameters. It's like the old card file, if you're old enough, like we are, to go to a library and search for information by hand. That was an index card. It just summed up the information, the Dewey Decimal System number, the category, the title, author, the publisher, you know, the date of publication. That's happening all the time with all of our online information. And then what the search engine will do is then it'll rank it. They'll just basically say, this person looked for this information. Let's get them the closest approximation to what they're looking for. It's almost like going to that physical card file, pulling it up, throwing all the cards in the air, and then the search engine's job is to kind of shuffle it to say, okay, this is what the person is looking for.
Yep.
And, you know, and how, again, how this works is that if you're ranked, and if I, you know, use this analogy a little bit further in terms of throwing those cards in the air, the ranking is getting that card as close to your search as possible, and that's the key for someone to click on it. chances are, if you're looking for something, you will not go past page 2 or page 3, unless you're really, really persistent, or you're working in an SEO and you really want to find out exactly where that page lives, right? So if you're not on page 1, page 2, page 3, then your information is, relatively speaking, not so visible to a certain type of search.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Another thing I think that we kind of talk about, or that I feel like it's very important for people to know, is that search engine optimization is something that's applicable to everything you do online. So we typically talk about web pages, but it's everything that's out there. So if you're an association that has white papers, you have documents, you have a PDF, you have a slide deck, you have any kind of information that you're sharing, that is also being searched, indexed, and ranked. And one of the hidden things that is really powerful for a lot of associations, if they have a public-facing presence, is the PDFs.
Mm-hmm.
You can really provide a great deal of information and content if you optimize those PDFs.
Speaking of PDFs, it makes you think about a client of ours who's got a really well-respected journal, and they have a part of their leadership team manages the journal, and yet the file names of the journal are some sort of naming scheme that doesn't make any sense to a person. I mean, I'm sure it makes sense to the people publishing the journal, but one of the conversations we had with them was, do you want to rename these PDFs and maybe put some metadata in the PDFs so they actually show up within the context of searches? And that's a discussion I think everybody needs to have.
Absolutely. And it's one of the first things that I kind of look at if I'm looking at a website, I'm looking at a content library, is I'll look to see is the PDF optimized, because it's a fairly straightforward process to optimize that PDF if you understand how the SEO works. And
Right.
For that trade association, there were certainly some of that content that people did put in there, and especially the name of the title that related to potential searches. And I know that as we're talking about this, I can go out and search for certain things and the PDF will show up. And there's also something too in terms of how the web pages are looked at. And again, that's reference to technical SEO, where you go underneath the hood and you set up some of the things that configure that file that makes it much easier for a search engine to find.
Mm-hmm.
And that will generate huge results. So you're not necessarily having to create page after page after page of HTML. You already have all this stuff potentially in PDFs.
Right.
Yeah. So again, it's just the notion that it's all SEO is a method, and all that you're doing is just trying to make your content more visible. So I kind of mentioned the idea on that last slide of an index. And in the case of how SEO works and how a browser is looking at it, is the browser is indexing everything in producing what's called a SERP, a search engine result page. So the example I have up on the screen is something where I'm just showing a search engine result page for a specific website. It's a summary of content. And the way that Google does it and other search engines do it is they essentially limit the information so that all the information that they're presenting, unless it's a paid ad or a video, are all presented in a similar fashion. You essentially have 5 lines of information that are pulled, indexed from a web page. It's a summary, and we can go further into this potentially in a different conversation. But all I wanted to kind of point out is that this is what the browser is doing when you're going to a search engine. Is it's just presenting all of this information. And most associations don't really know that they can control every level of this. Google is indexing billions and billions and billions of pages practically every second. They're looking for the quickest answer possible to match what they're trying to present to get a relevant result back to the user. And the reason they're doing this is they want to sell ads. They want to have you find your information and then sell ads that are relevant to that search so they can make money off you and I searching, right? And what I'm doing here is I'm actually using this little feature, and as you can kind of see in the bullet points, there's a feature that you can use, and it's a simple piece of code that lets you look at your web content the way Google looks at your web content. And all you need to do is type in site : space, put the name of your organization in, and then Google will index for you all this information so that you can actually see what shows up, what is important, what Google or any search engine thinks is relevant content. So this is a way to kind of check when you're going through SEO, how does this information appear on the web? And just kind of how we were talking about recently with how a PDF looks, it's one of the top things I typically do when I'm looking at an SEO, when I'm sort of doing an inventory of where their content is at. So that provides us with guidance.
When we talked a little bit about how we think it looks and how Google thinks it looks. Is this one of those places where you get confirmation of whether you were right or not, or whether Google looks at your site entirely differently? And am I stealing your thunder from another slide? Or
no, not at all.
Because it strikes me that we all assume, hey, our site is going to show up like this, but I didn't know about this thing until you told me about it.
Right. No, this is the honest mirror into your site.
Interesting.
This is where you're not sort of like pulling in your belly when you're looking at yourself in the mirror. It's an honest view. It's an honest view of what your web content looks like, and Google will do it for you. And all you have to do is type in SITE : space with your website's name, and you'll see how you look according to Google. And then you can kind of see what information ranks and what information doesn't rank. And just like how we were talking about how there's a gap in what we think we're doing and what we're actually doing, you'll have a surprise typically on that first page of all these results, because you'll see that Google thinks that you are providing a certain type of service when in fact you're trying to provide a different type of service. And that's because they're doing a very complex calculation based on the notion of value. Different pieces of your site do different things. And typically when we talk about this with customers, clients, associations, they're always typically surprised.
Right. Yeah.
And in this particular example that we're using, the top 2 or 3 different pages of information that were found other than the home page probably are things that maybe the association forum weren't necessarily aware of that they're being ranked for, but actually are good member values. They were related to things such as a job section on the website, and they're related to events through the association forum. So 2 particular services that this organization provided did rank fairly high. So again, just kind of looking at this in terms of how a browser sees your website, you can actually find out how the browser sees your website. A SERP is just simply a search engine result page, and it's a really good tool to use when you're looking at your content. The idea of how an online search works. I've kind of used this analogy about index cards. And all I wanted to kind of let people kind of think about in terms of a visualization is it's an extremely fast and complex matching exercises of the words and phrases you're using to what's available out there globally online. So whether you realize it or not, you're in a very competitive space for words, phrases, and topics. And Google and any search engine is searching such a vast collection of information that if there are anything that gets in the way of them finding your information quickly, they'll be buried deep into the internet and no one will ever see your content to even have a chance to click on it. So what they do, like what we would do if we're searching through something, is we're going to limit the resources. They're going to limit what time and energy that we spend trying to find a match for the keywords or search. And what they're doing essentially is an incredibly complex query, a question, into a massive database. And that database is all available content online. The value that we're talking about here in terms of how a search engine works is really just a conversion of what you're typing in as text. And then they start saying that text is going to equal to this type of information, and we'll start ranking these pages or websites based on a number of significant criteria to say, this is ranked 1, this is ranked 2, this is ranked 3, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so the search engine's essentially ranking your information based on the closeness of the match, the quality of the match, and the relevancy of the results. And that's essentially what they're displaying to you. We don't think about it because we're just so used to it, right? We've been searching online for 20 some years. We don't think about it. We say, okay, cool, here's what I'm looking for. I'll find what it is. The closest thing gets my attention. Click, I look at it. I spend 5 seconds, I spend a minute, whatever I'm spending. But that process is essentially what we can help to influence through SEO.